Rule Britannia. The first foray of Robert Riddle's and Ernest Stuart Cox into the production of standard classes for the new nationalized network produced a powerful Pacific. Though the engine suffered early teething problems and never quite endeared itself to Western region crews, it went on to become a successful and popular engine throughout the rest of the network. At a time when the very future of the railways was in some disarray, the Britannias proved that all was not gloomy, for a short time at least. Robert Riddle's first task after nationalization and as head of the newly formed railway executive was to begin designing and constructing a series of standard locomotive classes for use across the expansive British Railways network. Disrepair and maintenance backlogs had left the fleet in a hopelessly dishevelled state. The standard classes would draw on the methodology of each of the old Big Four companies, but ultimately Riddle's LMS links would become the leading influence. The actual design of the engines would be carried out by Riddle's old LMS colleague, E.S. Cox, who was made aware of the need for uniformity from the offset. Before putting pencil to paper, Cox organized a series of locomotive trials in 1948, designed to test engines from each of the Big Four and evaluate their relative merits. Though his intentions were fair, it was always going to be likely that LMS engines would eventually triumph. Riddles and Cox were already acutely aware of the pros and cons of the LMS fleet and could vouch for their economy, versatility, and ease of maintenance. Therefore it came as no surprise that the first British Railways standard engine was LMS-inspired. The BR Standard Class 7 Britannia Pacific emerged in January 1951, having been designed at Crewe and built at Derby. There could be little doubt that the new engine borrowed heavily from the designs of William Stanier and his mighty Coronation Pacifics in particular. Cox had clearly taken note of the results gathered at the 1948 trials and subsequently equipped the Britannia with 6 feet 2 inch coupled wheels. He had found that large diameter driving wheels were not essential in maintaining high speeds. Cox also found that with the quality of coal dropping all the time, wide fireboxes with large grate areas were a necessity. As a result, a trailing pony truck was employed to help cope with the extra weight and distribute it more evenly. It was just as well, for Cox's main goal with the Britannias was to fit the largest possible boiler within the maximum axle loading limit of 20 tons 500 weight. Number 70,000 Britannia was the first engine to be unveiled, entering traffic on the 5th of January 1951. Each following engine in the class, which eventually numbered 55, was named after a famous Briton, for example a poet, playwright, or historical figure. The engine underwent a series of tests between Crewe and Carlisle, hauling loads of up to 443 tons before being sent to the Eastern Region's Stratford depot. The first Britannia's successful test performances reflected the quality of its design and construction. Cox and Riddles had stuck religiously to BR's requirements throughout the process, making sure that they had done their utmost to achieve maximum steam-raising capacity. Surprisingly, in achieving this, Cox had decided against using a twin exhaust, probably based on the advice of Sam L., the leading authority on such matters. Using L's knowledge of exhaust systems and his own expertise in boiler design, Cox was almost able to guarantee that the Class 7s would not be blighted by steaming problems. BR guidelines were again adhered to with the inclusion of rocking grates and self-cleaning smoke boxes. Elsewhere on the engine, manganese steel axle box liners were fitted to add to their improved wearing properties, whilst Timken roller bearings and self-aligning axle boxes were fitted on the axles of the first 35 models. The Britannias also carried a Malesco steam dryer, preventing impurities from entering the superheater, thus keeping the elements clean and prolonging their working life. Throughout the design and construction of the engines, great thought was given to those who would eventually operate them. A full mock-up of the inside of the cab was made, and footplate crews were invited to offer their criticisms. The Britannias had been designed to cope with the post-war demands on an engine. They were strong, powerful, and most importantly could be worked extremely hard around the clock with few ill effects, something that the Eastern Region Superintendent, L.P. Parker, was happy to exploit. The stretch between London's Liverpool Street and Norwich had been in a state of stagnation for the previous 40 years, and Parker saw the introduction of the Britannias as an opportunity to move things forward at long last. The Class 7s were significantly more powerful than the 460s operating on the line, and were the first Pacifics to fall the right side of weight restrictions. Services were given a major boost, thanks to the engines improving both punctuality and frequency on the line, which had never seen anything greater than Class 5 power. 25 Britannias were in traffic by October 1951, 13 of which were working in the Eastern region. Three had ventured south of the river to work on Southern region rails, sharing boat duties out of Stewart's Lane. Only one Pacific, Churchwood's Great Bear, had graced GWR lines before the Britannias steamed into the area. Drivers were initially skeptical, and their feelings were backed up by the right-hand drive layout of the cab. Perhaps the Britannias were doomed from the outset, with problems being reported that rarely seemed to trouble other regions' locomotives. Excessive slipping was a common complaint from GWR drivers, despite the problem being easily avoided with careful handling. Admittedly, the Britannias did not have the glue-like adhesion of the castles, but very few engines did. Though crews in the western region seemed capable of finding faults when no one else could, there were some problems that affected Britannias across the entire network. The case of the breaking piston heads was relatively easily remedied. Investigations showed that the steam dome was too shallow, allowing water to enter the cylinders and cause damage. Deeper steam domes and stronger piston heads were employed, and the problem was cured. Much more worrying was the fault first encountered in July 1951 on number 70014 Iron Duke, as it hauled the exclusive Bournemouth Belle. The understandably concerned crew noticed that the driving wheels were actually shifting on their axles. This was not an isolated case. 6 other engines had been reported to suffer the same problem, resulting in bent or even broken coupling rods. Immediate action was required if a serious accident was to be prevented, so the entire fleet of Britannias, numbering 25 at the time, were temporarily withdrawn in October 1951. Engineers experimented with axle end plugs to varying degrees of success, but this was just a temporary fix, not a cure. The real problem was in the construction of the cannon-type roller-bearing axle boxes, which were found to be ever so slightly out of proportion. The slightest of changes were made to the way the axle boxes were built, and the Britannias were given a clean bill of health before being re-released onto the network. The Britannia's serious malfunctions had been fixed, but their quirky characteristics would remain for life. An often experienced fore and aft movement between the engine and its train was the result of the BR Pacific's quite unique two-cylinder design. Attempts were made to nullify the shuttling using a modified tender drawbar spring, but the effect was never fully removed. The Britannia's short but overall successful working lives began to draw to an end as early as the late 1950s. Their time in the eastern region was curtailed by the introduction of the diesel-electric Type 4 engine in 1958, seeing them removed from the Liverpool Street to Norwich duties on which they had become so loved. They were sent elsewhere on lesser duties within the eastern region before eventually making their way to the London Midland region. The southern region also began to phase out the Britannias, again in favour of the latest electric or diesel offerings. By 1963, the southern region's Britannias had been taken off the Golden Arrow Express passenger service to Dover and were sent to join their classmates on the London Midland region. The slow shift north continued throughout the early 1960s, as those that had gathered in the Midlands were transferred to the northwest. Here they had to make do with semi-fast parcels and freight services, their days as express engines firmly behind them. By 1967, there were still 42 engines in service, but the speed of withdrawal was set to increase. By December 1967, only 14 remained, and the closure of Kingmore Depot in January 1968 signalled the end for all of its locomotives. Only 2 Britannias survived, doyen of the class number 70,000 Britannia and number 70013 Oliver Cromwell. Number 70,000 is currently privately owned and has revisited the eastern region in full working order since its withdrawal. With the exception of a few Western region stalwarts, the Class 7 Britannia Pacifics were well-received engines amongst BR footplatemen. The engines enjoyed their fair share of prestigious turns on named express trains and covered virtually every corner of England and Scotland. Sadly, their late introduction meant that they were all too quickly replaced and removed after the modernization plan. Nonetheless, these LMS-inspired British Railways standard engines will forever be remembered for their power at the end of an era for Britain's railways. Four into one. When the Big Four fell into public ownership at nationalization in 1948, the new governing body had a quite epic task on its hands. Thousands of miles of track, rolling stock and staff needed bringing into line under one banner. Though Sir Cyril Hercombe and the railway executive made some quite significant progress, circumstances seemed stacked against them. Indeed, by 1955 their time had already expired, and the face of Britain's railways would never be the same again. When the Big Four fell into public ownership at nationalization in 1948, the new governing body had a quite epic task on its hands. Thousands of miles of track, locomotives, carriages and the like needed bringing into line under one banner. Though Sir Cyril Hercombe and the railway executive made some quite significant progress, circumstances seemed stacked against them. Indeed, by 1955, their time had already expired, and the face of the railways would never be the same again. The Big Four railway companies, Great Western, the Southern, the London and North Eastern, and London, Midland and Scottish, had held sway in Britain since 1923. Formed after the First World War, following a successful but costly period of government control, the four operators offered differing but quality services, maintained thanks to a keen but healthy rivalry. They had been forced to cope with some extremely difficult times, not least the revenue-draining depression of the 1920s and the Wall Street crash of 1929. The Second World War, however, proved to be one hurdle too many. Massive asset and monetary losses, the rapid and brutal closure of much-needed markets, and the worldwide slump that followed cast the railways into a downward spiral from which they would never recover. Unless, that is, something drastic was done. In the aftermath of war, the British government moved to nationalize the majority of large-scale and public service industries. Though some, like coal mining, were immediately consumed, financial restraints made it impossible to implement the plan across the board in one clean sweep. Having been taken under state ownership during the Second World War, the railways were in a terrible condition by the time they were handed back to each of the Big Four. With railway nationalization seemingly more of a when than an if, the British government sensibly decided to act quickly. The government was obliged to return the borrowed equipment and property to the Big Four in much the same condition as it had been before they commandeered it for the war effort. With that in mind, it was deemed far more economically viable to buy out the shares in four dishevelled railway companies than it would have been to fully restore their assets to their original condition. At the stroke of midnight on the morning of January 1st, 1948, the Big Four fused together and passed into public ownership. The entire British network, excluding the London Underground, Glasgow Subway, and a selection of independent light railways, now operated under the banner of the British Transport Commission. At its head was Chairman Sir Cyril Hercombe, a civil servant whose lack of railway expertise led many to question his appointment. Answerable to Hercombe was the railway executive, a group of highly experienced railwaymen who would be responsible for the implementation of BTC policies and proposals. Amongst them were Robert Riddles, Ernest Cox, and Roland Bond, all of whom had been employed by the LMS before nationalization. In time, this strong LMS influence would come to the fore. Managing the entire British network as a whole would have been a nigh-on impossible task. At the time of nationalization, the total rail route mileage was 20,000 miles, comprising thousands of stations, signal boxes, goods depots, and yards. 20,000 steam locomotives passed into BTC hands, along with 36,000 carriages, and a quite astonishing 1,223,634 wagons. The solution was to divide the network into 6 independent regions, each ultimately governed by the BTC, and 2 of which brought together varying lengths of ex-Big Four rails. Up until very recently, these companies had been the fiercest of rivals, so gaining their cooperation was almost as big a task as managing such a huge inheritance of stock and infrastructure. The new British Railways North Eastern region combined all northern LNER lines in England and all ex-LMS lines east of Skipton. The London Midland region consisted of all remaining LMS lines in England, along with all Welsh stretches of LMS track. The LNER's southernmost lines were the sole constituents of the eastern region. The southern and western regions were a far simpler proposition, quite conveniently being composed of just the SR and GWR networks, respectively. Most controversial was the new Scottish region, which saw the LMS and Scottish stretches of the LNER come together to govern the entire country. The cessation of hostilities in this previously hugely competitive area was quite an achievement. Though seemingly successful at first, the regions did not remain like this for the duration of BR's rule. In 1958 they were changed in an attempt to reflect geography more than previous ownership, seeing the northeastern region consumed by the eastern. To reduce the scale of this new enlarged region, it was decided that an Anglia region should be created, although this didn't come into place until the 1980s. Somewhat surprisingly, the changeover from the Big Four to the new nationalized network went almost unnoticed by the paying public. Changes were slow, timetables continued to run as normal, and many engines, carriages and stations still bore their old liveries for a number of years. Also, it was a while before the new company was able to produce its own engines, so the majority of existing locos continued to work the same duties in the same areas for many years after the change. The transition was slow, and though the railway executive gradually started to introduce standard liveries, the only major change in public perception was their acceptance of the new British Railways moniker. The time soon came for the BTC and the railway executive to start tackling the problems on the rails. The entire network was still suffering badly from the effects of war, and it was up to its new governing body to return it to its once proud condition. Attracting business was no problem, for the general public was eager to throw off the shackles of war and enjoy travel as a leisure pursuit once more. Holiday periods were especially profitable, with record levels of business recorded after nationalization. However, little of the revenue seemed to be making its way back into the railway system, seeing capital investments actually falling into decline. With the need for maintenance, replacement and building of stock so high, it was almost unbelievable that money was not being made available. Nationalization had been at the top of the government's agenda, but clearly investment in its future was not. Perhaps most worrying for the railways was the severe lack of available steel, vital in the construction of engines, rolling stock and track improvements. Any building of new engines would have to be carefully calculated and almost guaranteed success. The executive simply couldn't afford failures. It was in this department that the influential ex-LMS presence within the railway executive showed its colors. In order to keep costs down, the executive wisely chose to create a number of standard-class locomotives. Construction would be kept as cheap as possible, borrowing heavily from previous designs to cut down on the need for testing and also speed up their delivery. The price of maintaining and repairing the engines was similarly low because of the labor-saving advantages of using standardized parts. George Ivart's work proved to be particularly popular when it came to creating the BR standard stock. His Class 4 260 engines became the standard Class 4 2MT, of which 115 were built. Ivart's Standard 2 tank engines also went on to become the BR Standard Class 262 tank. They weren't the last of the LMS-inspired tanks either. Both the Standard 3 and 4 classes were loosely based on Derby practices and principles. The LMS influence did not stop there. Even locomotives that were built to new designs showed hallmarks of LMS practices. Typical LMS features started appearing on locomotives, such as taper boilers, high running plates, two-cylinder designs, and streamlined cabs. However, members of the railway executive from the LNER, SR, and GWR made sure their company's identities were not forgotten forever, as influences from across the board were soon allowed to break through. The GWR's pannier tanks were one such example. The structure of the newly nationalized railway did not stay the same for long. A change of government in 1951 sparked rumors that the whole process might be reversed, but this proved to be little more than speculation. Despite this, questions were beginning to arise over the way in which the railways were being run, prompting the publication of the Transport Act in 1953. Clearly, the new government was not a fan of the executive and used the act to bring about its abolition that same year. Instead, independent area boards were set up to manage the network and were directly responsible to the BTC. It was hoped that this would bring some stability to the railways and allow the BTC more control over developments. Sadly, outside influences meant that this was never the case. Ever-increasing competition from road traffic, spiraling costs and industrial unrest took a heavy toll, and once again, the railways were forced to take drastic action. In 1955, the modernization plan was released, bringing an end to the first phase in BR's life and plunging it into the second. The early years under BTC and railway executive control had been eventful and in some regards productive. The emergence of standard classes of locomotives had been a major step in the right direction, as had the creation of new regions. In contrast, confusion over investment and the apparent lack of planning for the future left the railway in disarray. The next 11 years would see dramatic and severe changes to the network that those involved in its nationalization could hardly have seen coming. Poor planning and the changing face of British freight and passenger movements meant that major line closures and ultimately the end of steam were just around the corner. Learning curves on the LMS. The London, Midland and Scottish Railways School of Transport was opened in 1938, with the aim of creating a better educated workforce. Combining the vision of E.J.H. Lemon, the management skills of Lord Josiah Stamp, and the years of educational experience of Colonel Lionel Manton, the school proved to be an innovative and extremely successful establishment. What's more, it provided wonderful opportunities for all those fortunate enough to pass through its doors. The London, Midland and Scottish Railways School of Transport opened for the start of the new academic year in September 1938. It was a first not only for the LMSR, but for Britain too. The school was formally unveiled in front of an intrigued public on the 22nd of July of the same year by then company chairman Josiah Stamp. He described the project as an experiment not only in railway management but also in education and contacts. There had long been establishments to aid in the engineering side of business on the railways, but the commercial and operational aspects had been traditionally overlooked. The school was purpose-built, catering for everything that would be required of it. Pupils were greeted by a striking foyer, 5 classrooms, 2 lecture theatres, one of which housed a projector screen and could double up as a cinema, and a library that would one day contain numerous textbooks produced in-house. Arguably the most eye-catching of the school's facilities was the Hall of Transport, where an extensive model railway was located to aid in practical demonstrations. The ability to show and involve the students in the various processes of railway workings helped in the learning process and proved to be a huge selling point to future pupils. The model, at roughly 6 times the size of a normal room, was a useful tool indeed. Lemon and Stamp also worked to ensure that the pupil's life away from the classroom was as comfortable as possible. Each student, of which there could be up to 50, had their own room fitted with wash basin, bed, comfy chair and desk. Elsewhere, separate student-teacher dining facilities were provided, along with sitting rooms, tennis courts and state-of-the-art facilities. The new school's first principal, Colonel Lionel Manton, brought with him a wealth of experience and a positive air of authority. Manton was an advocate of positive tuition, moving away from strictly academic methods and introducing practical demonstrations and real-life problem-solving activities for the pupils to tackle in groups. Lessons followed his 4-stage plan: explanation, demonstration, execution, and repetition. The school's Derby location had been chosen on account of the city's fine examples of extensive marshalling yards, associated control offices, all types of passenger traffic, scientific research parks, and locomotive and carriage works, all of which were covered in the school's varying syllabuses. Working examples nearby were a positive boon to the learning experience. The onset of World War II forced the school to cease operations for a number of years, but the doors were reopened soon after the hostilities had ended. The school positively flourished as a learning ground for British Railways staff. The School of Transport continued to go from strength to strength throughout the 60s and 70s, arguably becoming the world's leading centre for railway research, education and training, following the opening of British Railways Railway Technical Centre in 1964. Bill Devitt talks to Mike Lee about its history and some of his experiences.
Here on Rothley Station on the Great Central Railway, I've been joined by Mr. Bill Devitt, a gentleman who's had over 46 years experience of the railway industry, I think, Bill.
Something like that, yeah.
And you started your career at Derby?
Yep, straight from school.
So what was the 1960?
Yes, 19th of September 1960.
And how much did the heritage of the Midland and the LMS loom in the operations at Derby in those days?
Well, quite a bit, because there was the rivalry still going on between Crewe and Derby that had existed for several years, but it was more intense actually when you got to talking to the people at shop floor level. They didn't want to talk to their compatriots on the other side of the fence, and it was quite an interesting time, to say the least.
I know your involvement in engineering matters continued up until the Pendolino and the Voyager programmes, and that's a long way from LMS days.
Yep.
But of course, Lord Stamp's main problem after his appointment was actually to overcome that rivalry, wasn't it?
Well, I think so, and I think probably he had a couple of people, or even three people, I think, on the board who were definitely Midland men, and they're determined, I think, to actually improve the education and training rather than just have mutual improvement classes. And I think that's one of the reasons why it led to the consideration of the School of Transport in 1935. I think the plans were first put.
What sort of courses did they offer, do you know?
Well, they certainly offered quite a lot of signalling courses, and they used, as you know, the model railway round inside the middle of the building there, which no doubt we'll perhaps talk about later. But apart from that, when I was involved in the later years, they offered courses that were to do with assembly and disassembly of major components. They had a complete cab end of a Derby Type 2 loco. They had compressors, they had a diesel engine in there, and it was really hands-on experience outside of the maintenance depot atmosphere, which in some ways enabled people to concentrate on what they were doing.
What was your impression when you first went there?
Well, when I first went there, it was rather an odd experience. I only went a few times, but it all started by the time when I came out of my apprenticeship. I was appointed as the assistant to the works manager at Derby, and or general assistant it became known as when you were there. And one of the things he asked me to do was to write a publication or a paper for the Institution of Locomotive Engineers, and the publication was called The Metrication of BR Workshops. And what this meant was that it was a paper really quite wide-ranging as to how to get the BR workshops into what was perceived to be the 20th century by actually measuring in metres rather than measuring in feet and inches. So I had to go around various places, including the School of Transport, giving lectures and telling people the way that I thought perhaps it might be an idea to approach this problem.
And what did you think of the facilities there that were on offer?
Well, I think for the time they were second to none. And certainly when they were built they must have been second to none as well. And it was quite ergonomically laid out in a successful way inside, in that you had the classrooms around this centre congregation area, and that was really the place where all the outside of classroom activities were concentrated. The railway was an O-gauge railway, and I believe the loco and the rolling stock and probably some of the track as well was supplied by Bassett Loke. And Bassett Loke, of course, was located at Northampton, so they were very much on the LMS, as you know. In fact, I think there is an association between the Bassett Loke family and John Rennie Mackintosh, the designer in Scotland, because Bassett Loke's house in Northampton actually is a monument to Rennie Mackintosh. And I believe that there was a certain amount of dialogue between them and the people at the LMS who were actually involved with the design of the building at the School of Transport.
By 1997 and privatisation, the school had adopted the new name College of Transport and was being leased by Catalyst Training, a company specialising in rail training courses. However, much of what was conceived in the 1930s remains, including the eye-catching murals. These have been supplemented by more modern works of art in the lecture theatre. In the lowered lounge area, the piano remains an authentic feature. What is interesting about the instrument is that it was part of a donation originally made to the Webb Orphanage by LMS staff at Crewe and subsequently bequeathed back to the company just over 40 years later. Many other original features of the building have survived into modern times. The stone carvings on the exterior walls, specially commissioned by architect William Hamlin in the 1930s, depict various railway subjects and are a unique feature of the building. Today, nearly 75 years after its opening, the school continues to instill the ideals of its creators, Lemon, Stamp and Manton, into the pupils lucky enough to be selected to attend this illustrious centre of railway training.